Ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Sabi. We are now, I think, all present. The witness is back with us. Madam, can you hear us? Everybody, quiet, please. Mr. Sabi.
Yes. Are there any other questions from the tribunal for Ms. Xu Zheng?
Well, yes.
She was giving her answer, and in the
Maybe you
middle
ask
of
that question again, please.
my question was that if you contacted to the doctor who was in charge of the transplant center in the hospital in 2015, as you were advised.
Regina, you have a question?
After I made a phone call over there, they asked me to go there right away. Afterwards, there was no result. There was no follow-up. There was no outcome on that. Because I just called them to make inquiries. They didn't say anything definitely. The doctor does transplants, and they say if you want to do it faster, you can go to Shanghai or Zhejiang University Hospital. They had plenty of stock. They said stock. So if that's not live organ harvesting, how could there be stock?
Okay, there's one more question. At any time when she was in the labor camps, did she notice or witness anyone under the age of 18 in the labor camps that were Falun Gong members?
Yes. There were many university graduates. I was not labor camp. No, sorry, no. I didn't see anyone below age of 18 in the Shanghai female prison.
Thank you for joining us again, and I'm sorry that, and I hope that that break didn't cause you inconvenience, but thank you very much for making yourself available to give evidence, which is now concluded.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, if it pleases the tribunal, will recall Mr. Matt Robertson to give the tribunal further.
Yes, he's here somewhere, so
Evidence.
be found and brought in, or asked to come in, I should say.
Mr. Robertson.
Send bailiffs.
Here is Mr. Robertson.
Mr. Robertson, thank you for making yourself available.
It's my pleasure.
Yesterday, and indeed to the day before yesterday, and indeed today, and in different capacities. But
Pleasure.
There it is. Is there anything you wish to ask Mr. Sabi at the moment?
No, I understand tribunal has questions for you, Mr. Robertson.
Yep.
Could I ask you to the arguments and importance of and for the waiting times for transplantation and how they interact with the numbers that you can't tell us about from your next paper, but clearly are important for understanding the implications of or for a potential pool of organs.
Right.
And perhaps if you could, as you do so, highlight any evidence that you can recall verbally at the moment.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because in the way that I have looked at, the issue and the evidence, I mean, there are two kind of main considerations for suspecting that there's some non-death row population that's being harvested. One is simply, many reasons, but in any case, two main ones are the number of transplants going on and then, the immediate availability. But of course, if there weren't that many transplants and there was immediate availability, then you couldn't necessarily say that there must be some non-death row population. It's only that you have the two then yes. But the threshold for how many immediate transplants do you have to be doing until you can rule out death row, I think that's a little more difficult to figure out. But just in terms of the availability, you would have seen perhaps by now in the materials, but perhaps not, but the very well-known incident in 2005 in which Huang Jiefu, the leader of the transplant system in China, went to Xinjiang for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Xinjiang. He went with the security chief, Luo Gan at the time, and he did an autologous liver transplant. And so, for those who don't know, he took out the liver of the patient, excised the tumor from it, and re-implanted it in the patient's body. That's an autologous liver transplant. And for that, he ordered 2 backup livers to be delivered within 24 hours. So he called his home institution in Guangdong, and then he called a military hospital in Chongqing. And those backup livers were delivered the next day. So there is a pretty vivid case of, it doesn't appear that it was a coincidence that there just happened to be death row prisoners who had just happened to have the right blood type and were healthy and had their sentences approved recently. Though, in fact, when I recounted this case to a doctor who is friendly with a Western doctor who is friendly with the Chinese system, Michael Millis, he said that, indeed, there must have been a coincidence. And in fact, 2 coincidences. And I mean, you can't rule that out factually. So it's simply a matter of the kind of judgment you want to apply to it. But so in that case, I mean, it seems kind of obvious that yes, there's bodies that are available. But I'm not. So we can talk back and forth. But at what point do you need to do enough of that you can rule out a very unique use of the death row? I don't know. But we do know that it was a lot, like 30% in 2005 of all the liver transplants where they recorded whether they were urgent or elective were urgent.
So can you compare that, first of all, with figures available from Western medicine, non-Chinese medicine, and secondly, if you give us some indication of how long people might expect to wait for various organs in the Western system compared to the Chinese one?
Right. I haven't done a systematic comparison, in part because it's not always easy to get the data in such a simple form. But in some years that I've looked at, as I recall, and I can follow up and give you actual data with years, but I believe in at least some years in the UK, it was something like 14% of liver transplants. However, the big difference and the reason that the comparison, and then we can talk about waiting times in a second, but the reason the comparison is not necessarily meaningful is because, so for example, in the UK, it's a relatively small geographically, and then there is, all the hospitals are linked in a network where there is organ sharing. And so in China, obviously, that's not the case even now, but certainly from, early 2000s, there's nothing of that kind. It was, there's no national organ sharing system, and it's hospitals getting their organs from the prisons that are, nearby, and not even, I've seen some papers where experts are saying that the paramilitary system should set up an organ sharing network within their own hospitals. And that was just a suggestion, like, hey, we need to share our resources here. That's just within the paramilitary system. So you can imagine, like, the cross-jurisdictional, like why on earth, they're not going to be sharing organs, right? Like, because that's money in the bank, so to speak. So, no organ sharing system, huge geography, and these kind of hidden relationships between hospitals and prisons. So it's not comparable. Like the fact that it was 29% and then 26.6%, that's not because they're sharing organs. That's because they've got them on demand across the country at many hospitals. They don't give us the list, all the individual transplants in their record and at which hospitals. Because, theoretically, what if that's like 2 hospitals that are doing, but we do know that the distribution of hospitals that are contributing to the liver transplant registry is quite a lot, but we don't know how many make up the urgent versus elective. But we can presume, based on the other data, that it's a national thing. And medical papers also indicate that that there's national availability, or that these emergency transplants are happening at many hospitals across the country. So we do know, essentially, or rather we can infer that there has been immediate availability of organs matched across the country.
So let's go back to comparing waiting times for various organs. You can list them in any order you want in the West compared with in China.
So obviously it differs, but average waiting times in the United States from the data I've seen is many months to potentially years. In some cases, of course, it could be sooner, because if you're the most urgent, then you'll get the first organ that is available. And so, but that's generally not the case. It could be a long time. In China, the key difference is whether which way the matching is going. Do they have the bodies and then they're matching for the recipients? Or is it they've got the recipients waiting and now they're waiting for the donors, for accidental deaths and so on? And so, the data from Chinese websites and kind of these indications of emergency transplants and so on indicates that the matching is happening in the reverse manner, and that they have the donors and they've got them all in a big list, and now they're just sort of waiting for the recipients to appear, and then they get the donor and extract the organ. So we don't know, like, we can infer that is what's happening, or we can use our judgment to infer that is the most reasonable way or plausible way of explaining what we observe. There is also there is a clinical handbook that has a small statement by a military medical doctor, Shi Bingyi, which seems to hint at them having donors that are then matched, and I can dig that up for you guys. And then you could also consult hospital websites that were advertising transplants that were all taken down post 2006, but where there are archives, and they refer to having donors available, and that just and then from just the testimony now, there was reference to stock.
And this is consistent with the brokerage arguments that we've also heard over the last 3 days, so that a broker would, if you're living overseas, and a broker would find you an organ or a recipient in some place quite quickly.
It's consistent to the degree...
finding the donor, sorry, not the recipient.
Yes. So, I mean, it's consistent to the degree that the brokers have a relationship or have relationships with hospitals, and then they can contact, their people at the hospitals and get an idea of, availability for organs. Although we don't know, presumably there's a certain need to know aspect of it, and that brokers are not going to be very familiar, perhaps, with where the bodies are and all those details. But
in Western transplantation, I'm using Western China in a very arbitrary way, but I think you know what I mean. In Western transplantation, waiting lists for the recipients are often divided into urgent and non-urgent. In the Chinese system, is there any such way of working, to your knowledge?
Well, it appears that those who are more politically connected and or can pay more are the more urgent for transplantation. And so one case pretty well known is a Chinese actor, Fu Biao is his name. In the event he died, but he received 2 liver transplants. And the first was within a month of his needing it, and then after that transplant was rejected, or it was rather that the cancer came back, then he got the next liver transplant within a week or so. And that was, because he was famous, that was widely remarked upon. And his doctor for the second transplant was Shen Zhongyang. That's the very well-known liver transplant surgeon and president of the Tianjin First Central Hospital, and the guy who founded the Beijing paramilitary police's hospital's transplant center. So he's a kind of a well-known surgeon, and he took a lot of, so for famous people or politically connected people, the transplant doctors get a kind of political capital by servicing them. And one of the biggest hospital, or one of the most developed hospitals doing transplants, is the 309 military hospital, which is specifically for the healthcare of party cadres, and that has a very advanced transplant department.
I have 2 questions for you. The first is, with your work in this area, have you come across any literature or any evidence, I would say, concerning child transplants, child organ transplants, or the use of children in becoming donors?
Only, do you mean forced donors? Or
yeah, forced.
Only anecdotally, and not in a way that I was satisfied with writing anything about. Yeah, I guess that's all I can. I mean, so I have looked for, through medical papers. Now that we kind of have a more established database, it might be, I mean, I haven't looked subsequent to being able to do like full text searches across such a huge corpus. But when I searched previously, I couldn't find, this didn't pan out, essentially.
Okay. And then the next question I have is, we've heard today that there's I believe he was a doctor in Australia, that kind of sounds like he denies this happens. Is it plausible, based on the research that you've done, that China has reformed their system within the last 2 to 3 years with regards to this issue?
Well, so it's very interesting and complex what's going on. So first of all, I would say that for sure there is, in my opinion, there are actual voluntary deceased donations going on. I'm sure of that, or rather, I strongly believe that to be the case. And that's simply by reading, a bunch of these medical papers from these transplant operations and watching a bunch of Chinese, reading news reports and watching kind of like 60-minute style Chinese documentaries produced by the state broadcaster CCTV and other local state-run broadcasters. And what I saw was pretty convincing. I don't think they made all that up. But it comes with a huge caveat in the sense that one of the ones I saw, it was from, I've forgotten the hospital, but it was a hospital in Shanghai. So it was a first-tier city. It was one of the best hospitals. And there was a voluntary, like a citizen donor who, I forget the cause of death, but it was a genuine case. So for that, they mobilized, I believe they said, as I recall, and I've got this written down, it was 60 medical staff. Mm-hmm. And it's just a massive production. And the circumstances were just right for this case. And there are others, and so on. But it's certainly not at the scale that's claimed, where there, literally the growth curve is exponential. So, as Dr. Levy said, we have a paper coming out on this precise issue. Okay. And, it's been quite a process getting it published. But I think that uses only official data and really will put to rest this question of the extent to which the official claims are genuine, at least in as far as the data goes. But those few cases where, they are doing genuine transplants, they're still doing many, many transplants from all indications. So the idea that they're all of this kind, I think, beggars belief. And the paper will, I think, give very good answers to this.
Okay, thank you.
You seem, you've done a massive amount of work in pulling all of this together, and I think it would be instructive for all of us for you to summarize how hard it's been. And you've implied it a few times, but the work done to get data which is routinely available in other countries seems disproportionate, and it might be worth emphasizing or describing how hard that has been.
Okay, I think this actually is a very interesting, just in and of itself, the study of this issue is itself a very interesting issue. Essentially, until 2014, 15, there wasn't much, the research, okay, so just to rewind. There is no, or there is very little peer-reviewed scholarship on China's organ transplantation system. That itself is quite a remarkable thing, actually. So, you can, and I have go through the literature on China's healthcare reform, the pharmaceutical industry in China, hospital information systems, corruption in the Chinese hospital system, the change from socialized medicine. So the whole gamut. There's a recent book published just last year, a thick kind of textbook kind of volume called China's Health System and Reform by Cambridge Academic Press, I believe, and top scholars. You check the index, there's nothing on the organ transplantation system. So this is, to begin with, this is weird, in a sense, that this kind of this black hole, so in terms of the actual first-hand research on it, the stuff I'm doing is built on the work of, first of all, Kilgore, Madison, Gutman, and then you heard from Dr. Wang Zhiyuan, the World Organization to Investigate the Persecution of Falun Gong. So they are the first ones that dug up just this immense amount of first-hand stuff from Chinese hospitals. And so And then I'm kind of just like piggybacking on that, and then trying to use a systematic, social science research methodology to like, do it in a way that you can, you can say, for example, with scientific publishing, you have a recipe, like, we did this, and then we did that, and then we found this, and then anyone can duplicate it, and it's a kind of transparent, systematic process. So in a sense, all I'm doing is just that to stuff that, in a sense, has already been done. So the way that you get information, for example, is hospital websites, is biographies of doctors, newspaper reports, notices on official websites, medical papers, textbooks, clinical handbooks, nursing handbooks, and then you kind of put it all together. So, for example, that's essentially the research process, and then you can get bits from each thing. So we can talk, for example, about what I think would be one way of trying to get a minimally reliable number of the transplants that have taken place according to published Chinese medical papers. So, you do that, you scrape the database, you got like 120,000 papers, and then you have to first kind of sort them, like how many are clinical, how many are non-clinical. So this is what I'm going to do, by the way, I haven't done it yet. And then you would ditch, 2/3, and then you're left with the clinical ones. And then you're going to see like, there's going to be an overlap, because you don't know that the same organs have not been used in 2 papers. So then you have to like figure out like, okay, so if it's the same hospital, and it's say there's one that's like, we did 100 liver transplants in this paper from like 2003 to 2005. And then you have another paper that said we did, 150 liver transplants from 2004 to 2006. Well, now you've got like an overlap. You don't know the same organs were not used. So then like, well, if there are none of the same authors, then I think the way I might do it is you're going to call those separate organs. And then you're going to have a unique count. And then then I got to figure out like, okay, so if there's an overlap of one author, how do you allocate like how many organs for each? How are you going to do the count? Things like that. It's going to get like complicated very quickly to actually get a number. And I'm not even confident that we'll get a number actually from like such a huge database. Maybe what will be helpful is that some of these papers, they just say, as a matter of background, our hospital has done this many. They don't say how many in this particular report that were, that there was some condition or we're studying this intervention or whatever. And so, so that's one way. Another way is like hospital websites will say, we did this many, and then you can log that. But they don't say that there's not like a standardized reporting process where they say, they list all their years and they list how many of each organ they did. They just like mention it. And then sometimes you don't know when they published that. And sometimes you do. But it's almost always incomplete. So what I suspect is that we're going to end up with just imagine, a big table, rectangle of data, and it's got all the hospitals along the side, and then it's got the years we know they did, or rather not that we know how many they did, because even all these numbers, by the way, all the numbers, they can't be trusted necessarily. But we will at least know what they said. And then I think it will be possible to use some kind of predictive modeling to then fill in the data that you don't have. For example, if you can identify particular hospitals that have similar characteristics, such as the surrounding population, or will have different factors to kind of weight them. And then if you have the transplant, you have this many kidney transplants in this hospital for this year, and you have that many kidney transplants in another hospital for another year, and each is missing one piece of data, well, it's very unlikely that just because you don't have the data, they did 0. So it will be possible to use some process that, like, just a model, and that will have rules that are transparent and kind of common sense, and then you could kind of fill in the empty data, and there are kind of established practices for this in data science. So then we'll have a number. or will have a series of numbers or a range of numbers. But even then, that will have been from like using a process that may not necessarily be accurate, but it's just like your best guess. So this is like, you know, part of the research process. But with all the data that we already have, you don't kind of like, this is really getting into the weeds. You know, just with, and the report, I've got my organization, Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, we're preparing a report that has kind of a preliminary version of not this data, but just the build out of infrastructure and some basic tables and charts for the growth of the system in a kind of a simple way. Like, for example, and the way that we did it was we went through the Kilgour-Matus report and then the World Organization, WOIPFIG, I call them for short, Dr. Wang Jiyuan's group. So we went through all their material and just pulled out like a table, and then we made pivot tables based on it, of like each time a hospital reported doing the first transplant of a particular type. So that all the times the hospital did its first liver transplant, its first heart transplant, its first kidney transplant, its first lung transplant. The times that each hospital reported building a new transplant ward or department or research lab. And then you can see very clearly just that in 2000, everything took off. So very few hospitals reported doing their first liver transplant pre-2000, and then you see it just spike. Same with the first time they did a heart transplant or did a combined organ transplant, or the development of physical plant, you know, new building, new ward, etc. So all that just starts taking off post-2000. And there, that's already, you know, that's very solid, that's interesting data, and it totally doesn't match with the trajectory of the death penalty. So right there, you know, the Chinese government has a lot of explaining to do, because they have, you know, since 2006, they've had this official explanation that, hey, they've always been from death row. You know, sorry we didn't mention that earlier, but we promise this time they're all from death row. But that's not what all this data from their own hospital website says about the growth of the transplant industry. And I've shown this to scholars of the death penalty in China, and they're very intrigued. You know, they hadn't seen this before, and you know, they're puzzled and wondering, like, have we totally messed up like our understanding of the death penalty, like the whole death row system? And you know, so I don't think so. I think there's something else going on. But anyway.
Let me follow up with one point of clarification as well. When you talk about transplants and everything that we've discussed in the last few minutes, this is about the actual insertion of organs, and as a separate process from organ harvesting. So the number of transplants, the transplant centres, the transplant infrastructure that you're describing is insertion, if you like. It's the actual where the organ goes.
Yes.
And in parallel, there's a whole other system which we've been investigating here, which is about organ harvesting. Is that a correct interpretation of what you've described?
Yes. Although I will say that there are many medical papers that we're looking at that are simply focused on the extraction process.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We heard this morning from Wendy Rogers, who you may know, and she was talking about the reluctance of some transplant surgeons, actually particularly in Australia, to acknowledge that there might even be an issue. Have you talked to any of these surgeons, and if so, or even without so, are you able to throw any light on this?
What would you like to know?
Do you believe that they don't know? And if you don't, why are they being obstructed, maybe the wrong word, but whatever it is they're being.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Well, I can speculate wildly.
Sure.
I think that the basic understand. Okay, so first off, Huang Jiafu got his PhD at University of Sydney. He is perceived to be a known quantity to, so let's name names, Francis Delmonico, Jeremy Chapman, Phil O'Connell. He has been, networking with them for many years. I understand that they perceive him to be a colleague, a professional colleague, perhaps even an ally against the dark forces in China, the corrupt military hospitals and so on. And that if they don't make good with him, then, they have no impact at all and no relevance and no way to push things in a positive direction. So that's the first thing. So I'm right, so they haven't said this to me, but I've spoken with them a bunch, and this is kind of my own feeling of how things generally stand. And then on Huang Jiafu's side, the Falun Gong issue, or the prisoner of conscience issue, as it would be known, as an area of human rights concern, but specifically in China, it's not a prisoner of conscience issue in some vague sense. It's specifically a Falun Gong issue. And so that is extraordinarily politically sensitive, and that's a complete no-go as far as Huang Jiafu is concerned as a subject of open discourse, as in, you show me your evidence of why you think this is the case, and now we'll have a conversation and I'll explain why you're mistaken. No. Because if they were to try to go down that path and kind of show him the evidence that we're all discussing, it's not like that's, a friendly academic discourse that they're going to have together and kind of, let's get to the bottom of this together. And so what I suspect is that the condition for their having any engagement at all is not touching this issue. And I think that's pretty obvious. And so they've done so. That has, there's a lot that could be said about that. One consequence, at the very least, is it results in the transplant surgeons finding themselves in very awkward situations, I suppose, because they end up then sharing the podium with characters like Zheng Shusen, who's he's perhaps the top liver transplant surgeon in China, and he heads the anti-cult commission in Zhejiang province, which was basically set up alongside the 610 office, and it was in order to carry out the anti-Falun Gong propaganda and prepare the training materials for the transformation that we've been hearing about. So, he's the head of that agency, and he's a liver transplant surgeon. And, Frank Delmonico and others find themselves doing the, where you all stand together and, go team kind of thing. And so they didn't, they have no idea. They didn't know that he's that guy. So it's only when, bothersome people like myself and others go emailing, hey, do you know that who these people are? And then in Hong Kong in 2016, there was an odd occurrence where he was one of the presenters, and there was a bit of a contretemps about whether he used data from prisoners or whether his name wasn't read out. They tried to kick him off the group of presenters, but he presented anyway. I couldn't quite get to the bottom of what happened there, but so there is some awkwardness about that. And then, but I guess that's what you sign up for when you decide that this is off limits.
So in your opinion, it's highly unlikely that Jeremy Chapman and others are not aware that there is some issue around this, at least?
Yes, I'm sure Jeremy won't mind, but I got the chance to speak with him and Dr. Nancy Asher in Hong Kong. And, I was because I was also a little bit puzzled, like, so what do these guys really think is going on here? Like, because I'm genuinely curious. And I described to them the whole, like, emergency transplant thing and how, okay, so guys, how can we explain this? There's only two explanations, it seems to me, that they've got, a pool of donors that are pre-blood typed, or there's some extraordinary coincidence going on every occasion, and like that doesn't seem reasonable, so it's probably the case that they have this live donor pool. Dr. Asher, I don't think quite knew what I was driving at, because they only gave me 10 minutes and were very officiously monitoring the time. But at the end, Dr. Chapman said, I've got it written down, but it was a comment of the order of, I said prisoners. As in, I don't necessarily buy into the idea that there are only death row prisoners. That was his implied meaning. But it was a comment made to me just as we were shaking hands when leaving. And so, that and then other comments I've heard kind of just through back channels make me indicate, so it seems to me at least some of them must know something's not quite right. That's just my impression.
I think I have just one question, but we'll see. Obviously, the patients or the recipients of organ transplants are coming not just from China; they're coming from different parts of the world. Has there been any attempt, or do you know of any attempt to try and find out who these people are, to interview them? Or obviously, they have come with medical conditions already, so the doctors would then raise the issue, where did you go? How do you get your organs? Has there been any attempt to canvass opinion or find out from the medical profession even?
So I haven't personally spent a lot of effort trying to find people like this and interview them and so on. So finding out about that would really be country dependent. So there's, for example, there is some data on that in Taiwan, because researchers there were able to get access to, I believe it's insurance data, and then through a lot of passing of it, able to figure out some numbers. Malaysia, there was a doctor, I've forgotten his name, but he did a very good presentation. He had more data and much more detailed that had outcomes of transplants from overseas and had country of origin and so on. So that kind of material, but he obviously wasn't linked to names. So that kind of material, it kind of just depends on the country. And then, the kind of granularity of the data you can get. So you can find out some things. For example, in the Malaysia one, what was interesting, as I recall, is that and I've forgotten the medical details, but basically he had some indication that was like the quality of the organ, so to speak, and I'm probably overly simplifying it, but they were the same as with living donor transplants, like very, the ischemic damage was minimal. So that kind of indicates something along the lines of, the freshness of the organ. So for Middle Eastern countries where there might have been also many donors going to China, well then if those countries don't provide that, then, good luck. And there's no global way of capturing this, or requiring reporting and so on. I think some efforts have been made in that regard, but yeah.
And do you know of any country, like say in Israel as an example, where they have in some ways used legislation to prohibit people from actually going to China and getting organ transplants?
Yeah, Taiwan as well. I believe there was something in Spain, but I've forgotten the details. Israel certainly. And I believe there was an effort along these lines in Australia, but it didn't get past the state level.
I have one more question. Does the Chinese, and this may be just generally China hospitals or the Chinese military hospitals, do they have something equivalent to an ethics committee or institutional review board?
Yes.
Okay, what's the name of it, or is it?
They're called like the Hospital's Ethics Committee or IRB. So key thing, like it, the fact that they have them doesn't mean that they play the same role that we would typically understand them to play.
Okay,
if you know what I mean.
What would be the role?
Like rubber stamp.
Okay.
Yeah, like what the surgeon says goes, and chum chum chum. So that, and we've got a Dr. Rogers and I and other authors have a paper coming out that very soon that deals with this explicitly.
And just a couple of short things from me. You spoke of television programs that you credit as to their genuineness about voluntary donation. 60 Minutes, I think you said one of them was probably long.
A 60-minute style Chinese program, yes.
Do those programs, or did any of those programs, identify the start date of the voluntary program? And did any of them explain how the skills deployed in transplant were built on earlier practices?
For the second, no. For the first, in that one, I mean, so it's all the same. The party line, so to speak, doesn't differ in that the system began growing in the year 2010, and then by 2015 there were no more prisoners. So it all follows that. So the only reason I believe them is simply because it would be far too elaborate to stage, and then it's just kind of one case. And so, barring countervailing evidence, I credit it. It's not to say that the whole thing I've been fooled. Perhaps I was, but I don't think so.
I think Mr. Vetch has a question before my last one.
If you, and this is a sort of non-academic question in the sense, if you were to hazard a guess as to where will some primary evidence break in the sense of a Chinese doctor or somebody like that who has been engaged in this, because it will at some point somewhere, would you have any idea where that might come from?
No, I don't. But I mean, if let's say a Chinese doctor was somehow able to get his whole family out and bring original data from the hospital information system, that would be something. But even then, it wouldn't be. I mean, I don't know to what degree it would, because this is the thing, right? Like, we don't have a smoking gun. But you got to really think of what a smoking gun would entail, and if there was a doctor who came out saying, all the things that we've been hearing in the last few days, I mean, people would be saying, well, how do we know that what he's saying is true? The problem is so big, and the scale of what's alleged is so enormous. It's hard to think that there will be one thing that would kind of blow. I mean, I think that potentially would have kind of a PR effect, and given the kind of the amount of evidence and so on, I think to a large degree, at least in the public realm, it's more of a PR issue than anything else. And I would say where Huang Jiefu has been very successful is in handling the PR thing, because the transplantation establishment has been neutralized, essentially. And without them doing and saying anything, then other sectors haven't kind of moved. And
Chapman and O'Connell have declined to come and help us. Chapman describes the work of Mattis and Gutmann as a concoction based on political concerns. Your views are well known. How are you criticised? By them?
I don't think I've had the pleasure yet. I would be curious.
Has anybody criticised or assessed in a negative way your views?
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you very much for coming to the tribunal to help.
Geoffrey, I've got one more question. We've heard a number of times from a number of witnesses over the last 2 or 3 days that they have received personal threats about their own safety. Have you experienced any of that?
No.
Thank you.
I've heard a former journalist in China who I'm friends with, when going back a couple of years ago, was contacted by the Domestic Security Police, Guobao. It's the National Security Division of the Public Security Bureau. And they sent a couple of young agents to her to ask about me. So the fact that they were young and very friendly doesn't indicate that I'm taken too seriously. But at the very least, I was on record and they knew my name and so on.
Yes, go on.
Can I just add something? There's among China specialists, there's a sort of a game to see, okay, who is most excluded. And at one point I thought I had been blacklisted because my visa had been refused 6 times, and I got angry notes from several people saying, you haven't really been blacklisted, because when they do that, they send you letters saying that you've been blacklisted, so don't think that you're one of us. But one time when I was refused, my wife called up, and the person at the other end said, why has he been refused? And they said, 他应该自己知道，他为什么愿意被拒绝? In other words, he knows himself, which is very much the Chinese attitude. Rather than accusing you of something, they say, we know something about you, and you're going to sort of put up with whatever we do to you until you finally admit it and come clean. And when you do that, then we might talk to you again. So this is...
Is that a question?
It's not really a question. It's just to point out that there's nothing unusual about the fact that they don't engage you directly on the evidence.
The suggestion is that there's nothing unusual in your being engaged according to local practice. Do you accept that?
As far as I understand.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming to the tribunal and giving the help that you have. Mr. Sabi, is that the end of evidence?
And we have one last witness, Ms. Sarah Cook, that would join us from New York.
Thank you.
She's here.
Do we have a statement? Oh, yes.
The first thing.
Hello, and thank you very much for joining us.
Regina, you were listed to do this one. If you want to, it doesn't matter.
My pleasure. Sorry, the panel are just finding their papers, but I'm going to begin, if that's okay. We've seen your letter dated the 15th of November 2000 and... Sorry?
For the panel's benefit, Ms. Cook's evidence is page 172.
Thank you very much, and I should, I think, say to the witness, thank you for attending, and we hope that you will tell us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, as I'm sure you understand.
Of course. Your letter of November and excerpts from the Freedom House report, The Battle for China's Spirit, which was published in February 2017. The panel have seen that, and we will make the full report available to them as well. For the benefit of our audience who are here, could you give us a very brief summary of your professional background and the nature of the report I just referred to?
A research analyst for East Asia at Freedom House and been the primary China researcher there for about the last 8 years. I've been with Freedom House for 11. This was a special report, one of a series of special reports we've done related to China, some of it about events inside China, some of it about the way in which the Communist Party's censorship and repression extends beyond China's borders. And this was a report, it's really focused on religious revival, repression, and resistance under Xi Jinping, so since November 2012. And we tried to be as comprehensive as possible. So we looked at the full gamut of major religious groups in China, from Chinese Buddhists and Taoists to Buddhists to Christians, and there's a detailed chapter on Falun Gong as well.
And is Falun Gong considered a religion?
So in China itself, it was never really considered a religion or registered as a religion. The Chinese government only recognizes 5 religions. I would say in general, Falun Gong is internationally seen as a form of spiritual belief and could be qualified as a religion, though it doesn't have the type of hierarchical clergy, the clerical arrangement that you would think of in terms of an organized religion. Within China, it was initially recognized as a form of Qigong and really slipped through the cracks in terms of the overall regulation on religions. And then it was not deregistered from that, tried to register under the Ministry of Civil Affairs and various other arrangements before it was subsequently banned by the Chinese Communist Party in 1999.
And can you tell us about the organ harvesting of Falun Gong?
So the report really looked a little bit more background on what the research that we did was we were really trying to look with each one of the religious groups that we examined, the trends related to the revival or the nature of religious practice by that community in China, the various forms of repressions they faced, and examples of resistance. With regard to Falun Gong, we found the full range of forms of religious repression that you are probably aware of in China applies to Falun Gong. Large-scale arrests. Even today, we found large numbers of Chinese government verdicts related to Falun Gong practitioners being sentenced to prison. So during the period that we looked at from January 1st, 2013 to June 1st, 2016, we were able to verify 933 cases of Falun Gong practitioners being sentenced to prison terms of up to 12 years. And many more examples of people sentenced to various forms of extra-legal detention. One of the other things that came up across the faiths that we looked at was the issue of economic exploitation in various forms. And in the case of Falun Gong, we looked at, as part of this study on religious persecution generally and some of the political and economic dynamics that play into it, the question of potential organ harvesting. And particularly, one of the things we did, it was really beyond the scope to do an enormous amount of independent investigation. But what we did do is we looked at the various forms of available evidence from other investigators, including some of the ones that you have spoken to. We did speak to a number of Falun Gong prisoners of conscience, and we heard some of the same kinds of accounts of blood tests in custody and other there have been other, over the years, not just with regards to the research on this report, other cases of Falun Gong refugees that I had interviewed that spoke about various forms of medical tests. Or at the time, I didn't realize to even ask about this question. And later on, I learned, as news about organ transplant abuses came out, that they had experienced some of the same kinds of these kinds of blood tests, but even in some cases, ultrasounds and other types of medical examinations. We spoke to a Taiwanese doctor who had patients who had gone to China. And I think one of the things that really came out of that conversation was how difficult it is to reform organ transplant systems from prisoners or from an unethical system to an ethical one. And that was, I think very important for understanding why, and being a little more skeptical about the Chinese government's claims of transitioning in full to a voluntary organ donation system. And then one very striking interview we had was with a fellow from Beijing. He himself was a Falun Gong practitioner, and we were speaking with him about a wide range of issues related to the topic of the report, including Falun Gong practitioners' resistance in China, because he's very technologically knowledgeable. And so we were very interested to hear some of the things that people were doing inside China, from finding using mobile phones to the internet to reach people in China with information to counteract the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda. And towards the end of the interview, I asked him a question I was asking all of our interviewees, which was this question about whether they had experienced blood testing in China when they had been taken into custody. And I don't actually recall his particular answer to that question. But as we got into the topic of organ harvesting, he began to relay, very hesitantly actually, an experience that he had with regards to someone he knew who actually had been a former student, I believe, and had worked for a military hospital. And in 2011, this person had been sent on something of an errand to retrieve an organ and was told that the organ had come from a Falun Gong practitioner. And that was in 2011. That was a very a chilling moment in the interview. And then as we conversed with him more in other ways, there was other information he was able to relay that really added credibility to his account of knowing someone who had been in the system. And he was very hesitant to share the information because he was concerned about the person he knew. And that's one reason why we left him anonymous and didn't really try to anonymize his testimony. But I think in terms of, as close as I was going to ever get, as one ever gets to really a firsthand account of a Falun Gong practitioner detainee being targeted for organ transplant abuses, long after the initial evidence came out in 2006. I think that was really one of the things we were trying to look at with the research here was to what extent after the exposure was there evidence of continued targeting of Falun Gong detainees, and that was a very specific, an example of that. The last thing I'll say, and so, taking the above review and some of the other information related to the scale of the organ transplant system in China, we did come to the conclusion that the available evidence suggests that beginning in the early 2000s, Falun Gong detainees had been killed on a large scale for their organs. Now, one of the other things we tried to look at a little relates to Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but I'll pause there regarding the Falun Gong piece of the puzzle and see if there's any follow-up that you'd like me to say about Xinjiang.
We will have other questions on that. Just one final one from us. Does your research cover very much about the origins of the 610 office?
Not as much, but I had done previously research and published on the 610 office. And essentially the 610 office, it's this extra legal party committee and security force that was created on June 10th, 1999, before Falun Gong was officially banned. It was part of Jiang Zemin's efforts to get things going. And I can speak more about what the office does if needed, but it really operates in this extra legal arena, and it's particularly been focused on forcing Falun Gong practitioners to reportedly transform, so to renounce their faith. One of the things that we looked at in this report was the level of ongoing activity of the 610 office, and we did find evidence of it still being active throughout China. And we did some analysis of the budgetary expenditures and found, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was a fair amount of money being spent by the 610 office still during that period. But because of some of the purges as part of the Chinese Communist Party's anti-corruption campaign under Xi Jinping, we did actually find the 610 office had been quite weakened because its own head had been detained and sentenced to prison, and other people like Zhou Yongkang, who had been very closely linked to the 610 office, then he himself was sentenced to prison. So you didn't see quite the same level of top-down push by 2015 or 2016 that you saw even back in 2013 in terms of the persecution of Falun Gong by the 610 office.
Thank you. Are you aware, just one final question, offices being set up in response to other religions in China?
That's a good question. Well, one of the things that's happened with the 610 office over time is actually that its mandate's been expanded. So it does not only deal anymore with Falun Gong. That's the largest group that it still deals with, but it actually has a list of something like 23 various kinds of Qigong or quasi-Christian groups or other groups that have been categorized as these kinds of heterodox religions under the Communist Party. And so the 610 office, when you look at the documents, websites and things like that about what they're doing and who they're going after, it's not only restricted to Falun Gong. The other thing that you see happening is that as part of the Chinese Communist Party's expansion of its so-called stability maintenance effort, which applies to a wide array of other types of, in some cases, low-level criminal activity, but also other forms of dissent, you see some overlap in the bureaucracy there. A kind of almost modeling on the 610 office where it's also based in this party committee. And in some cases at the low levels, you see some of the same staff. So I think you do have that dynamic. But in terms of the creation like that of a specific extra legal security force, at the moment, as far as I know, the 610 office is fairly unique in that regard.
Thank you very much.
In general, the origins of the campaign of Falun Gong to go so dramatically from being a practice or a form of religious practice or spiritual practice that was praised in the Communist Party and media encouraged, and then to have that type of an about face is unusual. If you look at the other forms of religious persecution in China, it's often that it's tightening repression against an existing religion. It's a little bit slower. You don't have as much of a dramatic reversal. And I think one of the reasons you could think about that is actually because it wasn't registered as a religion. So it was this very, very quick flip on the part of the party.
Thank you. Panel for further questions.
Hi, Ms. Cook. I have a couple of questions. The first one I want to start off with is, what is the definition of religion that you used for this report? Or how did you define religion?
Well, and that's a good question. In general, I would say we looked at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that's for the most part our methodology. So it's looking really at Article 18, and which and I don't remember the wording off the top of my head, but includes not only formal religions, but also various forms of spiritual practice, of personal beliefs, of conscience. And that's one of the reasons why we included Falun Gong in a report on religion in China, alongside more organized religions like Catholicism, Christianity, or Islam.
Okay. In the report, you state somewhat at the beginning of the report that under the current leadership of China, that religious persecution has increased overall. And I was wondering if you could explain how, number one, how you determined it, but number two, whether there's been a policy change between this leader and previous leaders of China that would explain that increase.
Sure. What we did was we looked at each one of the groups, and what we did is we identified for both a combination of what their current level of persecution was, ranging from very low to very high, and then also the trajectory under Xi Jinping. And it was, I would say, a qualitative rather than quantitative analysis. There were certainly quantitative data that played into it. And, we looked at, I think it divided into 8 groups in the end, as we broke it down, including, for example, dividing Hui Muslims and Uyghur Muslims, Protestant Christians from Catholics. And we found that overall, the majority of those groups did face some level of increased persecution under Xi Jinping's leadership. And I would say that in general, repression under Xi Jinping and the tightening of political controls has become very clear in other spheres as well, in the media, against civil society, really across a wide array of various forms of human rights and civil liberties in China. There's been a tightening under Xi Jinping relative to Hu Jintao. On the other hand, in that, to some extent, Falun Gong was an unusual exception in that trend line. In general, we found that Tibetan Buddhists, Uyghur Muslims, Protestant Christians, and I'm trying to recall. Certainly those three, and perhaps there was one more, faced an increased, and Hui Muslims faced an increased level of religious persecution under Xi Jinping. We found that Catholics had a little bit more of an optimistic trajectory, partly because of the consultations, an attempt to reach a deal with the Vatican, and Falun Gong because of the dynamics that I just spoke about, where there's this unusual situation where Xi Jinping tried to basically purge his own political rivals that were very closely aligned with Jiang Zemin in particular, more than with Hu Jintao. These high-level security officials who were very active in the campaign against Falun Gong ended up being purged as well. And when you combine that with some of the grassroots resistance and outreach and education, including targeted to local members of the police force in China by Falun Gong practitioners, that created a dynamic where in some locales, there was a level of reduced persecution and more leeway for the police not to participate in the persecution as strongly. That being said, there's still very large-scale persecution of Falun Gong, as I mentioned earlier, and we found in terms of court verdicts and the like.
Okay, so on page 85 for the tribunal, you have a chart, a figure actually, a trajectory of religious persecution in China. I believe you're somewhat talking about this. So what I want to know first is, what are the elements that went into creating this trend explanation? Specifically, like, were you looking at laws, media, what were you looking at?
I think in general, we were looking particularly at the practical reality, but also at laws and legislation, especially in certain situations where a particular regulation may apply, especially to a specific religious group. So, for example, local regulations in Xinjiang became more strict and more stringent during this period. But we also looked at information related to arrests and detentions, information related to various forms of religious practice that had been previously accepted, certain forms of festivals, children's education that were becoming more tightly controlled. We looked at, so some of it was legal codification. Other elements were particular actual practical behavior by officials. And especially, I think, looking at the ways in which previously tolerated activities became not only not tolerated, but very harshly punished in some situations. And so that was what we were looking at. To what extent was the actual practical space for religious practice for these different communities becoming tighter or looser for them? In some cases, regardless of what the laws are, because Falun Gong is clearly banned. There's a vicious campaign. There's legal provisions used to sentence people, but in practice, there are these other political dynamics that create a little bit more space that wasn't there before.
So on this chart, for the benefit of the people who can't see it, at the top of it, you have Protestant Christians as an increase in religious persecution. The next is the Uyghur Muslims. Then you have the Hui Muslims, which indicate there's a minor increase. Tibetan Buddhists, minor increase. Chinese Buddhists and Taoists have a consistent, looks like, trend in persecution. And then you have Catholics. And last, you have the Falun Gong practitioners as a minor decrease in persecution. And you've already explained about the Falun Gong. But what I'm wondering is, from the Protestant Christians all the way down, are these groups also being targeted based on what you know for their organs? Or are they subject to organ harvesting?
I don't know for certain. My concern, I would say, and suspicion is that Uyghur Muslims are the ones that are most likely to be targeted. And as I wrote in my letter, I think actually since we finished this report, conditions have gotten worse. So one of the things we did do, because I was concerned about this question, was we actually tried, again, we had, it was only a small part of a much larger study. We did try to see if we could find information related to whether Uyghur prisoners of conscience had been blood tested. And we were able to speak through a translator to someone who had escaped China and was then in Turkey. And he had been detained in Xinjiang for political purposes, not religious violations, more political reasons and dissent, from 1997 to 2011. And we asked him the question of whether there had been blood tests 4 Uyghur prisoners in Urumqi, in the prison he was detained in. And it was interesting because he really didn't think that it was related to organ harvesting or organ transplant abuses. He was very concerned with the prevalence of HIV actually among Uyghurs and the way there were unsanitary conditions, and that HIV was being spread in that way. And he thought that may have been the reason for the blood tests. But one of the things he did say was that there were monthly blood tests administered to Uyghur political and religious prisoners and not to Chinese criminal inmates. One of the things that if you think and you were to combine the two of, potential organ transplant abuses and targeting of Uyghurs with a concern over HIV, it would make sense that you would do monthly blood tests to only that community. Otherwise, once you know people's blood type, you could, you could just do their blood. Now, again, that's some level of speculation, but it was also one of those conversations where if you're looking at the question of evidence of, what might be the circumstances under which Uyghurs would also be targeted, if he had said, no, we never had any blood tests, it would have been like, all right, maybe then they're not at risk. But that combined with conversations we had both with Tibetan prisoners and with him, also about mysterious deaths in custody and periodically mysterious injections given to prisoners from those communities. That was one of the reasons why one of the things we also flagged was that we thought that there should be concern over the fact that these populations may also be victims of involuntary organ harvesting.
So I have 3 more questions and then I'll pass it to my colleagues. So with what you just said, has it been independently verified that there is an HIV rate among the Uyghur population, or is that what the Chinese Communist Party is saying?
That was what this particular prisoner was saying. Okay.
That he was told, or that he knows?
Because it was not fully within the scope of what we were looking at with this study. I haven't looked at it further in terms of the HIV rates, but he was saying that particular prisoner, the former prisoner, was saying that he saw among his fellow Uyghur prisoners that there were people who were contracting HIV in prison.
Okay. The next question I have actually comes from one of my colleagues. We heard earlier, actually, I believe this was yesterday, that the practitioners, the number of arrests have gone down. So do you share the assessment that as a result, the number of organs harvested from Falun Gong prisoners would go down as well?
I think in general, I would say the breakdown of how the organs are sourced across different prisoner populations is, my sense is that it's some combination and that could vary over time. One of the things that is also less clear is what the precise scale of the extralegal detention of Falun Gong practitioners is right now. And I would say just in general, I think that probably those communities and those individuals were more likely targeted for organ harvesting than those who had gone through the formal judicial system and were in prisons, precisely because they were less anonymous and there was more documentation, perhaps. So I think it's potentially possible that now the percentage of Falun Gong practitioners who are being harvested for organs may be less than it was certainly in the early 2000s, when the sheer scale of practitioners who were in detention was much greater and when there was even less international scrutiny. I think also potentially the awareness among the Falun Gong community about things like blood testing and the risk of organ harvesting and family members being aware might help mitigate the risk for people, especially those who are more newly detained, because the family may be even more vigilant and trying to find where their disappeared family member has gone. But again, that's some level of speculation. And, one of the things with Falun Gong is even what we found among the prisoner cases is that people can be detained for very long periods of time. So, you have people who have been sentenced to 12 years in prison. People who early on the persecution were sentenced to 15, 18 years in prison. So even for among those people, if there is some level of organ harvesting, happening in the judicial prison system, you have Falun Gong practitioners, a large population of Falun Gong practitioners who have been there for some time. So even if you're not having large levels of new arrests, there may be a residual community of Falun Gong detainees that could still be targeted for organ harvest.
Okay, and my last question, and I'll pass it on, is your statement, if I heard you correctly, is that you all concluded, or that you know, that Falun Gong prisoners are a source of organs that are being harvested. And I want to know how you've come to that conclusion and what data you looked at, or how did you determine that?
So one of the things,
limited time. So if you could do it by headline, I think that would help us. We've got limited time.
Sorry?
We have limited time, and other members of the panel want to ask you questions. Could you please deal with this question briefly and by headline?
Sure, sir. So I think I've addressed some of that. I would say our overall conclusion was related to the harvesting of organs from Falun Gong practitioners in detention starting in the early 2000s. I think that the evidence was very clear, and I've kind of described some of that. And it was also based on just a very close look at some of the other investigations that others have done and finding that evidence credible. I think with regards to whether it was continuing during the period that we were looking at, we found that we believe that it may be continuing, but it was more difficult to find, I would say, conclusive evidence of that with the amount of resources and time that we had. But as I mentioned earlier, everything we looked at indicated that there was a good chance that it was continuing, suggested that it may be continuing, and it certainly had not stopped in 2006 or 2008 around the Olympics, which was initially when I had thought it might have ended as it was being exposed, and also as the Chinese government became more public about its reforming its organ transplant sourcing system.
In fact, there were no further questions. So thank you very much for...
If I could very briefly on the Uyghur question, in terms of the current situation, most of it is in the written testimony, but you have a situation now where there are estimates of over 1 million Uyghurs who have been extra-legally detained in Xinjiang, large-scale blood testing and DNA testing of that population, transfer of them to provinces like Heilongjiang that have a long track record of persecuting Falun Gong, and I think some expansion of transplants within the hospitals in Xinjiang. So I would just flag that in terms of, I think even since we finished the research on this report, greater reason to believe that Uyghur Muslims may be targeted, but I haven't independently been able to verify or do it in detailed investigation into that question.
Thank you. Evidence for the tribunal and for provision of your report. Your evidence is now concluded. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, that brings to an end the submissions that were made in this case, and thank you for your attention and cooperation for all the panel members.
Mr. Sabi, thank you. And members of the public may like to know that we will be delivering some closing remarks, but probably not, well, certainly not before 7 o'clock, but I'll hope to make it as close to 7 o'clock as possible. They're most welcome to be here at 7 o'clock if they want to hear the closing remarks. Otherwise, things will become clear on the website. And we'll break now until 7 o'clock or thereabouts.